Want some water, Jeff?
Yes, I'd love some, thank you.
Good morning and welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. My name is Amr Hamzawy. I direct the Middle East program at the endowment. I have the pleasure of introducing Jessica Barnes, who will share her analysis and her insights from her newly released book. I have the book right here. I enjoyed reading it. I recommend it. Is it an open source book, Jessica?
It is not, I'm afraid.
It's not, okay.
But it's currently on sale, 50% off.
Okay, so it has 50% off. So I strongly recommend that you get it. Staple Security. It's a very interesting anthropological, but not only anthropological analysis of bread and its relevance in Egypt. It has a lot of political and sociological relevance as well. An interesting book which emerged of your field research in Egypt over a longer period of time, and you will tell us more about it. Jessica is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina. Her work examined the cultural, political, and material dimensions of resource use and environmental change in the Middle East and beyond. She is also the author of Cultivating the Nile, came out of the same publishing house, if I'm not mistaken, Duke University Press. And she is here in town for a week, and she will be giving different talks at Georgetown, George Washington, and in Virginia as well. Welcome, Jessica. It's a pleasure to have you. I'm also joined by my dear friend and my dear colleague, George. George Perkovich is Carnegie's expert on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation issues. Are you still our vice president?
I am a vice president, yes.
So he is our vice president.
But I'm open to replacement.
No, we do not wish to have you replaced. So it's so good to see you and so good to have you. George and I go back a long time. My first assignment at Carnegie was between 2005 and 2009, and you were back then right here, a senior fellow heading the nuclear strategy and non-proliferation program, which is one of the biggest at the endowment. George will engage Jessica and engage you in a couple of remarks based on his reading and his analysis of the book. So we're very, very happy to have you on the panel. We are as well, so I'm welcoming you here in the room. We're joined by friends of the endowment and of the Middle East program who are zooming in, joining us in using our YouTube channel. I welcome you virtually. You're welcome to raise your questions and remarks by clicking on comment. We will make sure to revert back to you, get your remarks to Jessica, and we'll engage you in the discussion as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Great, I'm so happy to have you. This is my first event since I became the director of the Middle East program, and I'm so pleased to have you, Jessica, and have your book and your analysis as the topic which we are discussing today. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Amr, and for the opportunity to come talk with you all about my book, and thanks to George also for agreeing to act as a discussant. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So in my opening comments, I thought I would just give a brief overview of the book and my argument, and then draw out a couple of themes that I think might be of particular interest. So when Egyptian protesters took to the streets in January 2011, they called for bread, freedom, and social justice. العيش, الحرية, العدالة الاجتماعية. While much has been said about the protesters' concerns about political rights and social inequality, my book focuses on the food that also featured in the protesters' rallying cries. Now, bread here was in part symbolic. It was a reference to livelihoods, to people's kind of frustrations at their inability to build decent lives for themselves. But it was also literal. Some protesters carried loaves of bread in their hands, others fashioned helmets out of bread. They were calling for bread because bread is a food that Egyptians eat every day, 3 times a day. They were calling for bread because the years prior had seen severe shortages in the supply of the widely eaten government-subsidized bread and complaints about its declining quality. And to the protesters, these deficiencies were, I think, emblematic of the Mubarak regime's shortcomings. Now, as a staple food, bread is fundamentally tied to the staple crop from which it's made, wheat. Egypt grows a lot of wheat, mostly on small-scale farms, a couple of acres or so in size. But Egyptian farmers don't grow enough to meet their country's very high demand for bread. So about half the 9 million tons of flour that are needed every year for the government subsidized bread program are imported. To Egyptians, the possibility that their nation could run out of wheat or that they might not have enough decent bread to eat is an existential threat. It's a threat to the well-being of Egypt's poor, for whom bread constitutes a major portion of their caloric intake, and it's a threat to the stability of the state. History has shown that people don't sit idly by when they don't have good bread to eat. So in my book, I introduce this concept of staple security to describe the practices through which people seek to counter this threat and secure the consistent supply of a palatable staple at a national level, but also at the level of individual households. To take each part of this concept in turn, by staple, what I mean is that a food that defines a meal. A staple is a food that if it's not on the table, people don't feel like they've properly eaten. And I remember back in 2008, which was a time of considerable bread shortages in Egypt, and I talked to a man who told me how he'd been to the bakery that morning and there hadn't been any bread left. And he said to me, "I couldn't bring bread for my children today, they won't have anything to eat." But by this, he didn't mean literally that his children wouldn't eat anything all day, just that without bread, they wouldn't be properly nourished. As one of my Egyptian friends once commented to me, it's impossible to last a day without bread. Bread is something fundamental. So staple security brings together this particular kind of food with the notion of security, a theme, of course, long theorized by political scientists, but recently taken up more broadly by scholars in other disciplines like anthropology and geography. This work has expanded conceptualizations of security beyond just national level concerns about kind of maintaining stability and policing borders, to think about how security is something that infuses people's daily lives, both as a lived experience of kind of fear and risk, and also as a form of practice. So I use stable security as a deliberate point of departure from a much discussed concept of food security. One of the things that I found really striking about work on food security is that despite the inclusion of the word security within this concept, explorations of security itself remain remarkably absent. Food security tells us little about the deep anxieties that surround efforts to obtain particular foods or what might happen in their absence. A bland definition like this one commonly cited from the FAO about people being able to access food stands in stark contrast with the square in downtown Cairo thronging with protesters. Food security also isn't very helpful for thinking about staples specifically. As you can see from this definition, nutritional balance is now a really key part of how policy scholars, policymakers think about food security. You can't be food secure just by eating bread. And this was brought home to me during my research when all the people I spoke with in Egypt who were working on food security issues never talked about bread. And all the people working on bread, except to sometimes say that they thought that Egyptians ate too much bread, and all the people working on bread and wheat issues never framed their work in terms of food security. So there's a disconnect between how people experience security related to a specific food and how policymakers think about food security. So staple security, therefore, focuses attention on staple foods because these foods are unlike others in their existential importance to people's daily lives and to the legitimacy of the state. This is why their absence or their substandard quality poses such a threat. The affective dimension of staple security captures both a political leader's fear of the bread riot and the unsettled feeling a parent has when there's no bread left in the home. It also captures other forms of affect, the pleasure of eating a meal with freshly baked bread, or the yearning for breads that taste of rural childhoods. People care, in other words, what this bread tastes like. The other dimension of staple security is the concrete actions through which people seek to secure that presence of that palatable staple. And these range from the government's operation of a huge subsidized bread program to small individual acts within the home, like freezing and heating a loaf of bread. The book draws on ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in Egypt since 2007. I'm an ethnographer, so I draw on qualitative data drawn primarily from participant observation, but also from some interviews. In 2007 and 2008, I lived in a village in Fayum province, which is a couple of hours from Cairo. At this time, I was doing research for my dissertation, which became my first book on irrigation in Egypt. But all the farmers who I worked with grew wheat, most of the women baked, and everyone ate bread. So data from this first period of fieldwork, along with repeated visits to the same village since then, are the ethnographic foundations of this book. But I also wanted to look at what was going on in urban areas. So I worked with an Egyptian research assistant, Miriam Tahir, who between 2015 and 2017 conducted participant observation at the bakeries in Cairo that sell government-subsidized bread. And what this kind of long-term, in-depth ethnographic fieldwork does is shed light on the everyday dimensions of baking, buying, and consuming bread, both among those who depend on the subsidized bread and also among those who grow wheat and bake their own. The book follows wheat from the seed through its cultivation in Egyptian fields and import from overseas to its consumption as subsidized and homemade breads. And I'll be happy to talk about any of these themes in the Q&A. But for now, I wanted to just speak to two themes that I think are of perhaps some policy relevance. The first relates to the war in Ukraine, and the second to the subsidized bread program. The Ukraine war has brought global attention to grain markets and the vulnerability of countries like Egypt, which is so highly reliant on imported grain. As I said, Egypt imports about half its wheat, and in the 2020-2021 year, 85% of that wheat came from Russia and Ukraine. And this is largely because of proximity. That's what makes wheat from the Black Sea so much cheaper to Egypt than, for example, wheat from the US or France, because it's so much closer. Those shipping costs are lower. From the Egyptian perspective, the timing of the start of the conflict was fortuitous. The government buys wheat year-round to supply flour for the subsidized bread program, but from April through June, it procures wheat from the Egyptian harvest. So when the war broke out, the government had some grain in storage, like in silos like these, and was about to enter the 3-month period when it doesn't import wheat. What it did then was try and buy as much of the Egyptian harvest as it could. It did this by increasing the price at which it purchased wheat and requiring all farmers to sell a minimum amount of grain to the government, as opposed to keeping it for themselves. So farmers aren't, in theory at least, allowed to sell their grain directly to the private sector. My research, however, raises some questions about reliance on this price-centered policy approach, which the government is also planning on pursuing for the coming year. Because smallholder farmers, and the vast majority of Egyptian farmers are smallholders, don't grow wheat primarily to sell, they grow it to eat. They grow it so they have wheat in their homes to bake the kind of homemade bread that most prefer to eat. This is what the bread looks like in Fayum. In other parts of the country, it takes on kind of different forms. While farmers will sell any wheat that they have left over that their families don't need, making money isn't their driving motivation. They grow other crops for that. In Fayum, they typically grow onions. That's their real profit-driven crop. So if farmers aren't growing wheat to make money, they won't necessarily respond to slightly higher prices in the way that the government anticipates. In 2008, this woman, Marwa, harvested 6 ardab of wheat. That's just under a ton from a half acre of land. She kept 5 ardab for her family to eat and sold 1. 7 years later, her household had shrunk to 3 as one of her daughters had got married, and she had one son who was away doing military service. That year, she harvested 10 ardab of wheat. She kept 3 and sold the rest. Marwa is always talking to me about prices. The price of her children's marriages, the price of flour, the price of gas. The one price she never talks to me about is the price she gets when she sells her wheat. For her, wheat isn't a way to make money. It's a way to get flour so she can bake her own bread. So on the one hand, you have the government who sees domestic wheat production as a key source of flour for its subsidized bread program. On the other hand, you have smallholders, who are those largely responsible for growing this wheat, who see domestic wheat as a key source of flour for the production of the homemade bread that they prefer to eat. Any policy that fails to take this into consideration fails to recognize these distinct and sometimes conflicting logics, one really centered on national security, the other on household security, is, I think, unlikely to be successful. At the same time as the government has been seeing how much of the Egyptian harvest it can buy, it's also been looking for alternative foreign sources, importing wheat from France, Romania, and Bulgaria, and entering into talks with India. The government has secured a loan from the World Bank to try and help finance these imports, which are likely to be more expensive due to higher grain costs and also higher shipping costs. But if grain continues to be a severe burden on the budget, it raises the question of whether the government will have to cut other things. For example, earlier this year, when the government announced a new round of fuel subsidy cuts, the reason they gave was that they needed to save money to pay for their grain expenses. There's also the question of whether this budgetary pressure could lead the government to reduce the bread subsidy, either by decreasing the number of people who are eligible or by increasing its price, a prospect that Sisi has floated on several occasions over the past year. While economists have long advocated for these changes, as someone who thinks about subsidized bread not as an object of policy, but as something that enters into people's homes and bodies and becomes part of their lived experience of security, I really worry about how this will impact Egypt's poor majority, those for whom bread might be one of only a few things that they can afford to eat these days. This leads me to the second point that I want to talk about, which is the subsidized bread program. In 2014, the government introduced some pretty major reforms to the way in which this subsidy program operates, introducing an electronic smart card to mediate access to this bread. And there were a number of other dimensions to the reforms, which I can talk about later if of interest. But before this time, anyone could buy bread at the subsidized price of 5 piastres a loaf. That's less than half a US cent. Now you need a smart card, one of these, it looks a bit like a credit card, to access bread at the subsidized price. And there's a limit of 5 loaves per person per day. So if you have a family of 6, you're entitled to 30 loaves. And if you don't want all that bread, you can save up the bread points and use them to buy other subsidized goods. Many people talk about these reforms as having been a success. There aren't lines at bakeries anymore, and most people say that the quality of bread has improved. At a time when other costs of living are rocketing up, this subsidized bread provides a vital support, not just for those below the poverty line, but also those in the middle classes who are also in situations of precarity. In the case of Egypt, we're talking here about 70% of the population. Now I want to pause for a moment on this photograph. These men have laid their bread out on the floor on sheets of newspaper and cardboard. Why? Well, what they're doing here is letting their bread cool before they pack it in a bag and take it home so that it doesn't become soggy. Look closely, and all around Cairo, you'll see people doing this, airing their bread wherever they can find a space, stacking it carefully to make sure that it doesn't get crumpled, checking their loaves to make sure they aren't torn or burned. These practices are small. Maybe they seem insignificant to some of you. But to me, they reveal just how much people care about this bread. They show the time and effort people put into ensuring that they bring home good bread for their families to eat. I'm therefore struck by news reports regarding Egypt's current negotiations with the IMF for a new loan. Based on these reports, it seems that at one point the IMF was calling on Egypt to remove all its bread subsidies, a condition to which Egypt refused. Now, I think all of us can probably appreciate why Sisi would be unwilling to risk the political unrest that such a move could incur. But the fact that international experts would even push for this, to me, signals a fundamental misunderstanding of the importance of bread in Egypt. My concluding point, therefore, is that not all foods are equal, and policies regarding social safety schemes and food access have to take into consideration the cultural and political significance of staple foods. Now, it may be that this notion doesn't really resonate so much in the US. We don't really have a clear staple here, unlike if you might think of bread in France or rice in East Asia, for example. But in places where there is a strong attachment to a staple, I think we need to recognize that. To Egyptians, bread is about so much more than just the nutrients and calories it provides. As they often say, bread is life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for an amazing presentation. Very, very grateful, and I'm sure everyone in the room is, and virtually as well, for the excellent way you presented your research findings and highlighting the different policy significant points which are of interest to us, but your research is of interest as well. Let me now pass the floor to you, George. I know you read the book and you read it carefully, and you have some points and questions for Jessica, so please go ahead.
Thanks,
and then we'll open up the floor.
Thanks, and it's great to see you here. It's unusual that I would be talking about this book or even having read the book. I'm a nuclear weapons kind of person. So let me explain why briefly. Jesse is a dear friend of my wife Sarah's. They were in grad school together. Jesse sent us a copy of the book. I came home, it was sitting on the table, and I thought, oh, Jesse, she wrote a book, great. And I opened it up and I thought, well, I'll read a page. And I read the first page and I went, wow, this is really good. And then I read the second page and I go, Jesus, this is really good. And then I read a couple more pages and admiring the writing and getting drawn into it. And then a mouse runs across the scene where she writes, and she just had me then. You have to read it to see, so a lot of it, not a lot, but there's some of it that's in first person, and it just really delightful and almost has a feel like a novel where she's describing things, and part of from her research, whether it was in 2008 in the village that you have the picture of and other things. So I got drawn in just basically because of the art of it. And then as I got into it, the topic itself, bread was interesting, but and I think it's largely in anthropology, but there are other disciplines now too that write about affect and affective security or affect more generally. That is not something that people who do hard security, which is basically focused on weaponry, think about, and so it makes us all Neanderthals. But reading about affect and the bringing in of affect, how people feel about things, I thought was super insightful, not just in this area where it's more obvious, but others. So I was drawn in for that reason as well, and I just started learning a lot. I then got, as I was reading farther, Jesse at one point, almost in passing, mentions that the concept of staple, or the essence of a staple, and she's talking about bread, and she made some passing reference, it may be like gasoline in the United States. And I was like, yeah, that's it. And if you think about what happens to President Biden's popularity, for example, when gas prices go up or they go down, and how people go crazy, with their gas lines or not gas lines, and all of that. And so it registered in a way, and that led me to my first question really, is that the degree to which a staple kind of infuses nationalism or is part of nationalism, it just occurred to me, because you talk about whether it was Morsi or then later Sisi, and how bread became part of the protests, and so could you, and maybe it's wrong, but the way in which this kind of staple infuses national identity in ways that may then become part of contests for power.
Yes, I think absolutely it does. So the staple food, and I think that's not just in the case of Egypt too. I mean, I think you see very similar. There's a long history of bread in France, obviously, and rice in different East Asian countries. So I think it's not just there. But absolutely, I think there is a huge identification of this staple food with the nation, captured in this very cheap loaf of bread, but that the government has subsidized. But yes, I think it's very sort of explicit. Egyptians will often make this comment about how the word that they use for bread is different to the word used in other Arabic-speaking countries, and it's because in Egypt they call it aish, which means life, and they sort of use it as a marker of Egyptianness. Yeah, so I think absolutely those kind of national links are very explicit.
So there was another part that also made me kind of extrapolate. So because I'm not an expert on Egypt or bread, or so you kind of read through stuff that you do. I've been working more on technology lately, and so this is going to be the smart card is what I want to ask, because in many developing countries, there's more and more emphasis, and also from the international financial institutions, on digital transformation. So using mobile digital technology as a way to bring disenfranchised people or people who've been excluded into a system, and there tends to be a lot of enthusiasm for it, both from big northern institutions, basically, and then also the companies, right, that produce these technologies. And so your example of the smart card was I thought, so illuminating, because it showed both the benefits, but also from a perspective of people on the ground, how complicated it is, and not complicated and hard to understand, how mixed the good and the bad are, and also how many different people have to cooperate in order to make it happen.
Yeah.
I was tempted, I was planning to read, because it's just so beautifully written, this 3-paragraph section on it, but I maybe I shouldn't. Talk more about that, and then the story of FISA.
Yeah.
Because this could be like a movie. It's in the book, but you read about this woman, you just kind of go fast, wanting to know what happens to her.
Yeah.
So talk about that.
So it's a really it's a very sort of sad story about this woman called Faiza, who my research assistant Miriam worked very closely with. And in 2016, she's ill for a few weeks, and so she doesn't go and buy bread with her card. And one of the things about these smart cards is if you don't use them for a certain period of time, they become deactivated. So when she gets better, she goes out to go and get bread, and she gets told that her card isn't working. And she tries, for a year or so, she tries to go and get cards. She goes to the bureaucratic offices, she fills out paperwork, and she's just never successful. She can't get this new card. She can't work out how to get this new card. She's an elderly woman. She is literate, but she is elderly and not highly educated. And so the meat of this section that I described was then when Miriam returned to Egypt and offered to go with her to go to the bureaucratic offices. And so then we have this very in-depth data of this excruciating process of trying to navigate the Egyptian bureaucracy, being sent from office to office, being told you need to fill out these papers, you need to fill out these papers, no, you need a note from the police station, no, you need this document, like all these conflicting. And to cut a sort of very, very long story short, she doesn't end up getting her card until 2019. So she goes 3-4 years without having one of these cards. And although she can survive, she'll sometimes buy the slightly more expensive non-subsidized bread, or sometimes friends who don't need all their loaves will give her family some of their subsidized bread. But it's a real strain. She really has that affect of feeling insecure without access to this bread. So that case does sort of show how, the bureaucracy behind getting these cards and keeping them working is actually very convoluted, and it's particularly hard for elderly people or people who are illiterate, which is a very sadly large chunk of the elderly population, especially among women in Egypt. It's particularly hard for them to navigate. And the final element of this story, she gets her card, but she doesn't get the PIN number. And then it sort of goes on for another few months, this saga, because she can't work out how to, and the PIN number is delivered through mobile phone, but she can't really work her mobile phone, she can't work out how to send the text message, and it sort of drags on even more there.
Well, and I think there's a broader implication about just how transformative technologies can be. So you have this card, and it's meant to be transformative, and then you bump into a system that's just a system that's been there a long time, it's going to be there a long time, and the tensions between those two things.
But I think in Egypt, the way this smart card system, it wasn't introduced as a way of kind of enhancing access. Right. It was actually introduced as a way of kind of addressing corruption or sort of black market, like of in a way precluding access of people they thought weren't really eligible, shouldn't be taking this bread. But I think the other point I'd make is that even when you have these electronic systems, they just open up new points where you can get corruption. So now you have a baker who has a good relationship with the company that manages these smart cards, these little kind of handheld card readers, and they go in and change the data. And so there are just different points where you can then intervene and get what you want out of the system.
So I have more questions, but I'm going to stop because I want to share, Jesse, with all of you. But it is really a fascinating read. So I would urge you to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Before coming to you and to our virtual friends, let me ask you two questions as well, based on reading the book. And I agree with George. It's a fascinating book, and I love the way you write. And I mean, the first time Jessica and I discussed planning the event, I mean, so I was asking her, where did you do your ethnographic research? And so she said in Al-Fayoum, and I was passing by Al-Fayoum. So I was in Egypt on my way to the village where my family comes from, which is in Upper Egypt as well. And I was literally passing Fayoum. So I said, it's on my right, I can see it. And then so we had a chat about the ethnographic research, and the beauty of what you did is that you did it over a long period of time. So I mean, it's not only reflection in a moment, it's a reflection in 10 years, in which Egypt saw a lot in terms of social, political, and economic changes and transformation. So it's a highly representative timeline you work on, and it's very nicely written. It really moves between highlighting the stories of families and of women, primarily elderly women, and beyond, highlighting their personal stories and their access to bread and the way they see it, and then zooming out and looking at the larger significance, which for society and even from a political perspective. So I really enjoyed reading it, and I would like to congratulate you on the book coming out. My first question is back to the smart card issue, because you're right. I mean, in a way, introducing smart cards was the government's highly recommended by international institutions, by big donors, but as well by the Egyptian government as a way of combating corruption. The government subsidy program is huge, and corruption has been endemic, and since the 1960s, 1970s, and so Egyptians would always hear about, do not go to that bakery, go to the other one, and from little corruption to endemic corruption. So on balance, Jessica, I mean, do you have any sort of data proving that this smart card program is effective in minimizing corruption?
No, as I said, I think it just opens up different forms of corruption. So one of the big changes with the 2014 reforms was that the government used to give subsidized flour to the bakeries. So the bakeries that produce this subsidized bread are privately owned. They're not government owned. So the government used to give them subsidized flour so they could produce this cheap bread. Now, since 2014, they give the bakeries have to buy flour at the market price, and then they can reclaim from the government the cost of production and a little profit margin for every loaf of subsidized bread that they sell. So they have to sell it at 5 piastres a loaf. The estimated cost of production now is about 80. So for every loaf they sell, they can reclaim 75. I'm not sure actually if the government's increased the amount, but it's 60, 75 piastres a loaf. So that's what these smart card readers do, is they log how many loaves of bread people are buying. So the government, each bakery can then go to the government and say, okay, can you reimburse us for this money? But as you say, I just heard I don't have data. Well, my data is what I heard a lot of stories about bakeries somehow managing to kind of fix the data that went into those card readers. So somehow kind of logging that they'd sold more bread than they had so that they could reclaim that money back from the government. Or a number of stories of people saying that when they went to use their card, they found that they actually had less money left on it than they thought they had.
Right. So I mean, I was intrigued by Faiza's story, by the different aspects of it, but especially by the deactivation component.
Yeah.
So that's one of the issues which you would find in public debates in Egypt, that it's said widely that the lists of Egyptians eligible for subsidized bread, that the lists do contain scores of people who passed away. So one of the reasons why her card got deactivated, probably, I mean, I'm looking at it based on what I would read from the bureaucracy, but I mean, the bureaucracy in Egypt is quite, I mean, does communicate, especially when it comes to bread. So the deactivation would be related to not using the card because they would fear that you would have still, and they call it cleaning up the list of eligible Egyptians. So if you do not use it for a specific period of time, it would be deactivated until you activate it again. But then for that, you would need sort of to go through the bureaucratic hassle, which you described nicely.
I suppose that underscores the difficulty of when you kind of make electronic one aspect of your society, but you don't have other aspects fully kind of database-ified.
Yes.
You can't think of the word. So the fact that they have to do that just like to guess, you know, she doesn't use it for 3 weeks, maybe she's dead, and they don't have like a system of like reporting deaths into a system that it could kind of feed back.
Yes, exactly. So it's probably, I mean, it's a bit sort of stuck in the process of digitizing and digitalizing the way the Egyptian bureaucracy operates in general, and then it creates a lot of, as you said, I mean, different difficulties, corruption emerges in a different way, you combat some old forms and new forms come up. The second question I have is back to the very interesting point you made about the IMF and the Egyptian government and the ongoing negotiations, and it really keeps coming up every time Egypt comes to the IMF. For a new loan, the question of the subsidy program, the bread subsidy program, is always out there. And so your point was highly, I mean, as far as I am concerned, I mean, highly relevant. I mean, it's shocking to an extent that the IMF would continue to push the government to take off the subsidy, which sustains so many Egyptians, especially in a moment where the government is trying to extend social safety schemes. Different programs are being pushed forward. We do not know how effective, but you read about coverage being extended. So how would you, I mean, what would it take to convince international institutions of not continuing to push Egypt or other countries? Because, I mean, the same happens in Jordan, the same just happened in relation to Tunisia, the same will happen in relation to Morocco. I mean, I'm only looking at the Middle East and North Africa. So what would it take? I mean, what are they missing?
Yes, I don't know. I don't know if they're just so sort of blinkered in their economic approach. They're just thinking about the economy in these very kind of narrow ways and sort of missing thinking about people's everyday lives. You know, I'm not an economist, so I mean, I can see that there are some issues in the Egyptian economy with very high expenses, but just to me, it seems that there are so many other areas where cuts could be made.
Right. Yes.
And I am sort of baffled that they keep asking for this, that they keep demanding this. And, you know, certainly the government has made a number of changes over the last couple of decades in response to the IMF pressures. I mean, they've reduced the size of the bread, actually. They haven't increased its price, but they've reduced the size of the bread. But yeah, I was sort of surprised to see that they keep pushing for this.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, George, once again. Let's now come to you and open it up for questions and remarks. Let me start first by you in the room. Any questions, please? I see a hand. Please go ahead, ma'am. So would you mind using a mic, please?
Okay. My name is Nurmeen Riyad. I'm the executive director of Coptic Orphans. We do a lot of work in Egypt, and I'm fascinated by what I'm hearing. I've got two questions. One is, what is the ranking of bread as a burden on the Egyptian government in all their subsidies? How high up is it or low? I'm trying to imagine scale. And then the second question is, I love this, you know, it's a love affair between the Egyptian people and their bread. Is there waste? Is there a lot of waste? How does that fit in with their lifestyle?
Yes. I don't have the statistics off my top of my head, but I'm pretty sure the bread subsidy is substantially the most expensive. It's the largest subsidy. Does that sound right to you?
It does. I'm not sure as of now about the gasoline subsidies as well, but probably bread is a bit higher. But
and they have reduced the fuel subsidies over the last year.
They are reducing it constantly.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it is a big burden on the government, definitely on the budget. In terms of the second, waste, no, I think that also I don't think there is a lot of waste. Within the household, people are very careful with the bread. They, if you serve a meal and people haven't eaten all of a loaf of bread, they'll dust it off and reserve it at the next meal, kind of keep it nice. People don't throw away bread. There's really that's almost haram, to throw away bread. And even we noticed an interesting practice outside. You see this, people don't throw bread in the trash on the street too. They'll often kind of leave a piece of bread out, or if they don't want some bread, they might leave it on the side of the road in a bag, hoping that someone will pick it up who needs it. So there's really a kind of cultural norm against not wasting bread. And there's also a feeding of bread, sometimes bread scraps to animals, which some people talk about in terms of waste, but I think that depends on your perspective, because if you're then going to eat those animals, that's to me, it seems a productive use of those little scraps of bread left over.
Thank you so much. Questions? So we're being helped just by our junior fellows. Muhammad and Aya. Muhammad is moving around the room, giving a mic to you when you raise your hands, and Aya will be helping us with virtual submitted questions. Please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So my question is about the information ecosystem surrounding bread policy, and particularly government communication strategies you alluded to a bit for managing this affective insecurity at the moment, or security or insecurity. Thinking about, I remember when the IMF loan conditions were publicized, those are obviously in and of themselves politically very explosive, and people hear about even the possibility that subsidies might be lifted. So I'm interested in what you see now, particularly in the context at the moment with the war, and this possibility that of different policy options, some of which may affect people really adversely, others may provide more security. What those communication strategies have been and how people have responded to them, particularly, what kind of trust is there at the moment in the government's capacity to manage the crisis or the potential crisis surrounding bread. And then, I don't know, from your ethnographic research also, maybe you could speak to the more informal channels of circulation of information about bread and about changes in bread policy. Particularly because when I don't mean rumors in a negative sense necessarily, but when information starts circulating informally, that in of itself can lead to bread riots or whatnot. So
yeah, I think there's definitely a very kind of keen effort or what I see as a keen effort to manage that information that's coming out and to create this sense of security. One of the things I write about in the book is these recurrent headlines about kind of every shipment of grain that the government buys. It's kind of, we bought this amount of grain and we have this much in storage in silos. Almost, I can't really imagine those kinds of headlines in the UK press or in the US press, except in relation to gas perhaps.
Exactly.
But it's like this recurrent, and it's trying to create this picture of kind of security. We have this much grain in storage. This is going to cover the next few months of bread. So there's definitely that kind of effort to, and since the war in Ukraine, there's been a lot of kind of high politicians sort of trying to reassure people, we have a lot of grain in storage. We did a great harvest this year. We bought loads of grain from the Egyptian farmers. So I definitely see a kind of an effort to cultivate that sense of security. And it's done through this very kind of specific kind of reporting of the amount of grain they have, which, maybe the average Egyptian isn't interested that they got 80,000 tons from country X, but together they combine to create this picture of, oh wow, we're buying a lot of grain and the government's doing its bit.
Any more questions in the room? Yes, please go ahead. And would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Hi. Oh, sorry, couldn't tell if it was on. Hi, I'm Tia. I'm with World Food Program. And my question is regarding the smart cards as well. I was wondering if the introduction of the smart card program to cut down on corruption was also kind of a mechanism to cut down on the overall cost, since the subsidy program is so burdensome to the government. And I was wondering if you saw any sort of just overall reduction in cost of the program, and if it also was a bit of a covert means to reduce costs without inciting any sort of social unrest related to cutting the program, since so many people are having trouble accessing those funds now with the electronic program.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think by cutting down on corruption, you can, if you're cutting down on this siphoning off of subsidized flour to other kinds of bread, that's a way of saving costs. So in that sense, it was an effort to save costs, to prevent this kind of any flows of this highly valued subsidized flour kind of moving where it shouldn't go. One of the interesting things when it was first introduced is that, some people might talk about this as a shift from a universal to a targeted subsidy. But when they first introduced it, the eligibility criteria, although they're slightly vague, were so broad that most kind of policy commentators said this is essentially still a universal subsidy because you now have to kind of jump through these hoops, but they're so broad, the kind of income levels are such that still the vast majority of Egyptians kind of fall into this category. However, in 2019, the government tightened those a little bit and they introduced some new criteria and said, for example, if you have a very high cell phone bill, we think you're too affluent to have this bread. Which introduced a whole other sort of suite of problems. So maybe moving forward, they will use this as a mechanism to reduce costs. But I think the driving motivation was more kind of to make it more efficient, to cut down on this corruption and thereby reduce costs in that way.
Thank you so much. Let's now move to our online audience and Aya. Aya is our junior fellow as well in the Middle East program. Would you mind, are we getting questions from our
we have
online
a couple
audience?
of questions
Please
from
go ahead.
our online audience. The first one is technical, and it asks about if there was a specific estimate of the requirements or a specific set of requirements for obtaining the smart card, and how, if there was a public estimate of the access of the smart card.
I mean, there are specific but there are specific criteria, but they're quite vague. And also there's a question of how are you going to evaluate those? So it's, for example, so there's particular criteria, like for example, if you're disabled, if you're unemployed, or if you're a public employee, but you earn less than a certain total per month. But, the question of kind of how you prove that eligibility isn't always straightforward. And that's why in these new criteria in 2019, they introduced these things, these other kind of other metrics to determine someone who's worthy of this bread. Like, for example, if you have a high cell phone bill, or for farmers, if you had over 15 acres, then you were deemed not justifiable, not to be justified access. The estimated reach of the program is about 70 million people, 72 million people, so that's about 70% of the population. That's since 2019. Pre-2019, it was more like 85% of the population.
Thank you, Jessica. I have another question from our online audience, and it asks about the political future and regarding how would the increase in population impact the political future. So it says Egypt's 3-child per woman fertility rate and momentum are projected to put population over 260 million, up 50 million from today. How does that impact trends or projections for the political future?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it will obviously generate additional challenges, but typically, I'm a little bit wary of population-driven crisis narratives because I think it's often so much, it's so rarely is population really the problem. I think there's plenty of resources, it's just a question of how we are allocating them. So I think population can be a way of displacing blame onto those people, the poor people who keep having too many children, and away from directing attention away from governing authorities who are making decisions about where their resources go.
Any more questions from our online audience? I see your hand.
Oh,
Go ahead,
yeah.
Aya.
We do have a question about the silos that were built in 2014. And
The what, sorry, I'm sorry?
The wheat silos
Okay.
that were built in 2014, and regarding their effectiveness in helping furthering food security in country.
Yeah, silos are really a key part of this story that actually I hadn't really thought about very much before doing this research. So the government has been investing a lot in its grain storage infrastructure, because if you don't have anywhere to put your grain, you can't import it, or you can't buy it from Egyptian farmers. In fact, people will say, like, even if the government was able to kind of persuade farmers to sell more of their harvest, they couldn't really do that because the Egyptian government doesn't have anywhere to put it. So over the past kind of 5-10 years, the government's really been, well, it's a longer history, but particularly recently, they've been investing a lot in their storage infrastructure, both in building new silos and also ensuring that they are better quality so the grain doesn't deteriorate once it's in there. So yeah, that's a key part of the story, actually, is thinking about these places where grain rests in the kind of commodity chain.
It's an interesting part of the book. There's a whole section about the silos and storage. It was quite interesting in the book.
Yeah, and it also has this affective dimension of that kind of feeling you have when you know that the national silos are full. That's kind of that can be reassuring.
Right, and they are becoming. I can only attest to the fact that they are becoming more present, visibly present.
Oh, really?
So when you take, I mean, if you would go from Cairo to Upper Egypt, I mean, where I come from, I do not know how it looks in the Delta region, but I suspect it would be the same. You visibly see an increased number of silos, and that's really part of the question you were just raising, Jessica, on resource allocation. And so yeah, I mean, it's back to the population increase. It's legitimate to look at it, but it should not be sort of taken out of context. I mean, it needs to be put and placed in relation to how the government or how authorities are investing resources, in which different ways, and how it relates to the population increase. I mean, Egypt has the highest population increase rate in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa, and that is definitely a policy factor everyone is struggling with, but it should not be taken out of context, as you were saying. I mean, seen in relation to infrastructure investment, resource allocation, and so on and so forth. But I saw your hand, so back to the room. Thank you so much, Aya. Mohammed, if we can get the mic to, and if you would introduce yourself, please.
Of course. My name is Joshua Benjamin. I'm the legal director at Coptic Orphans. For an organization that does focus primarily most of its efforts in improving the lives of the vulnerable in Egypt, how can we, I guess the question is, where should solution-oriented thought be focused? Is it more along the lines of technological advancement so that we can improve the efficiency of creating the bread, the stable food here? Or is it more focused on political bureaucratic efficiency and improving the bureaucratic efficiency so that either less people need the subsidy or that the people that do need the subsidy have access to it in a more efficient way?
I mean, I'm a little wary of any move towards kind of this question of who needs the subsidy, because I think need is such a difficult thing to kind of really capture. Coming back to the gas example, do we really need cheap gas? But it's become to be a kind of an expected part of. So I think I worry about too much discussion about kind of let's distinguish between who really needs this and who doesn't. I mean, I think definitely there are places where efficiencies can be made, where processes could be made more. I mean, a lot of this production is still done pretty manually. However, there's a reason for that. I don't think it would be a good policy suggestion to come and say, well, let's mechanize it all and do big factories, because that wouldn't match the kind of, certainly in a city like Cairo, in the distribution, it's all these little alleyways and people have their neighborhood bakery. There's no scope for making a big factory. So, but there are certain places where things could be made more efficient. But I suppose my question would be, is inefficiency serves some people's purposes? So you have to kind of think about, rather than coming in and sort of saying we should do it this way, this is more efficient. It's probably pertinent first to think about who is gaining from it actually being slightly inefficient here. Because I think there are a whole load of people who are gaining. Some in only a pretty small way. I mean, these bakers aren't making loads of money. They're just trying to make lives for themselves. But, that there might be some efficiencies that are serving their interests, or allowing them to kind of save a little bit more for their next child's wedding, So anytime you make things, kind of tighten things, then someone's going to lose out.
Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Safal Yaqoubi. I'm from Morocco, so I find your remarks and the discussion very insightful, because we do have a love relationship with our bread, also sugar, because we love our tea as well. So this is another one that we can mention as well. We're headed towards more pronounced era of food insecurity, disrupted supply chains, wars and conflicts, and corruptions as well, managing food subsidies as well. My question, I'm not even sure if you'll be able to answer it from an ethnographic point of view, because you lived in Egypt. With all of these issues and challenges in the future happening, how do you see a change of Egyptians or Middle East, MENA region relationship with bread? Do you see it happening? Have you thought about that?
I mean, I wonder if it's kind of a kind of new era, like if everything's, I mean, there's different kinds of challenges and pressures today, but there's always been sort of different kinds of insecurity around food. I mean, I think it's just the kind of where the pressures are coming from are perhaps shifting a little bit. I mean, I don't see a change in the foreseeable future. One of the things that's interesting, sometimes you see, this is my kind of pet peeve, when you see policy people coming in and saying, well, why don't they make bread with sweet potatoes? I saw this recently. I don't know if you saw that. Why don't they put sweet potatoes in their bread instead? Or why don't they eat X instead of bread? And I think those kinds of arguments are pretty limited because I just don't think there's like that easy substitutability. There's a reason people like the taste of wheat-based bread. Sweet potato bread doesn't taste the same. I don't mean to imply a kind of static society that's not changing. Obviously things are changing. The kinds of bread people eat changing is changing. Like in rural areas in Egypt, for example, they used to eat much more corn-based bread. Now it's shifted to more wheat-based bread. So I'm not implying that that's sort of just completely frozen in time, but I think there's something very deeply significant about this bread that I don't see changing in the near future.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We are coming to the end of our discussion. We still have 4 minutes, and I see 2 hands. So I was planning on giving you, Jessica and George, a minute or 2 for closing remarks. If we can do without that, I would just take the 2 questions and get back to you, Jessica, and then you can share your closing remarks. Matthew and you in the back. Muhammad, so first row, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm Matthew Medane as a research assistant with Carnegie. Considering that food insecurity is a global problem now, and considering also the high cost of shipment of U.S. grain to Egypt, do you think there is a critical role for the U.S. to play in promoting Egypt's staple security?
Thank you. Let's take the last question as well, and then back to you, Jessica.
Thank you. My name is Mariam. I'm working in Coptic Orphans. Thank you so much for your discussion. It really resonates with me because I come from Upper Egypt and I've been through this.
Which
the
part?
whole experience. Asyut.
Okay.
So I know what when you're talking about the cards and when you're talking about the deactivation of the cards. I've been through this. Like I know a lot of people that they've been through this. So thank you so much for for talking about this. My question, I believe you said when you were talking about the food security, you said the people and the government or the policymakers are perceiving the term, like the food security, differently. Do you think they perceive the importance of the bread to the Egyptians differently or not?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think Egyptian policymakers, I'm sure that they are highly aware of the significance of bread. I'm sure they come from families where, I don't question that. But it's more the people who are kind of working in the field of food security, the people who that's kind of their job title or they're working on projects on food security. They're not really looking at bread at all. They're looking at things like how can you get people to eat more vegetables and fruits, which is also, that's very important, but I just feel like that's kind of removed from actually what makes people feel secure. So I'm not saying that's not important. And we do know that there are a lot of health problems in Egypt, and perhaps people do eat too much bread, but so I guess it's just that sort of disjuncture in terms of the people who are actually kind of framing their work in terms of food security. They're not really looking at bread at all. But I 100% think that they know this. I don't think that what I'm telling them will be new. It's just they're not perceiving it as part of their remit. And then your question in terms of the role of the US, I mean, maybe the role of the US could be to help communicate to the IMF to stop pressurizing or pressurizing for bread subsidy cuts. It's interesting about the US grain exports. I mean, in the past, some people might argue that they are actually responsible for making Egypt more insecure because Egypt became very highly reliant on imports at a time when US was exporting its subsidized grain through the PL 480 program to Egypt. So some people would argue that it's made the kind of opposite impact. But in coming years, it might be that US grain is sort of fulfilling a valuable need to the US, but I'm not sure. I think they certainly haven't been buying any recently, not much recently. They've been turning to alternative sources that are still not that far away, like France or Romania, for example.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's
Oh,
been a
thank you.
fascinating panel discussion, and I now know, and you might agree, what the IMF needs. I mean, they need to consult more ethnographic researchers, anthropologists, so we get a better sense of how bread or any other staple food, how important it is for specific countries. Thank you so much
Yes,
for,
thank you for
coming.
coming.
Thank you, Jessica, very much, and thank you to our online audience. It concludes our session.
Thank
It was
you.
such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.